And good morning, everybody. It's nice to see so many faces there, so many people joining us this morning. We're pleased to welcome Roberto Buccioni from the Università Vita Salute San Raffaele and the Head of Research in Integrity at the Ospedale San Raffaele. So he's going to speak to us today on research integrity. Roberto.
Hello, good morning, good evening, good afternoon, everyone, depending on, of course, where you're listening from. In the meanwhile, I'll just start with my presentation. So, as the title of my talk suggests, I'll try to give you a perspective from the research institution side on how to deal with research integrity issues and corrections and retractions of papers when dealing with journal editors. Of course, I only speak for my institution and for myself, but I rather doubt that my MO would be dramatically different from other institutions elsewhere around the world, well, at least in terms of basic concepts. So let's start. Just to give you an idea, I work in a large research hospital. It's one of the largest in Italy. We're based in Milano, and although it's not a very large university, it's a very large hospital, not a very large university, although it is mainly focused on medicine, dentistry, and some aspects of life sciences. We have around 5,000 students in that, but the real message I want to give you is that we have almost 380 active clinical trials, maybe a few more right now. I don't have the updated number. We deal with 50,000 inpatients a year, 1,500,000 outpatients. We have 30,000 surgical interventions, et cetera, et cetera. But just to give you an idea that this is a very busy hospital with lots of scientific activity and production. So this is just to give you a flavor of the type of institution I work with. So I would like to start by mentioning how in the university, my role is head of research development, and I retain also the title of head of research integrity for both the hospital and the university. So as head of research integrity, of course, research integrity office, of course, I learn of potential problems in submitted or published papers, among many other things. So how do I learn of these potential problems? So the first avenue is, of course, direct communication from authors, which can stem from, which could be spontaneous because one or more authors realize that there's an issue, a problem, a mistake with their paper. Or, of course, it could be indirect because prompted by a journal communication via an editor or some other mechanism. So that's one potential avenue. Of course, we also deal with third-party complaints, which could be from internal third parties or external third parties. And of course, these tend to be rather more complicated because they can imply a Pandora's box situation where, of course, matters get very complicated and very sticky quite fast. Or it could be a complaint with a limited scope that can be dealt with rather quickly and easily without major disruption of activities or professional lives. Another avenue, of course, is through the PubPeer dashboard. We, as an institution, have a subscription to PubPeer dashboard, which essentially is none other than a mechanism through which I receive updates in real time whenever a paper co-authored or authored by researchers in my institution are somehow flagged on PubPeer. It can be, of course, any type of comment. It could be a discussion. It could be a critique on interpretation. And of course, it can be also a identification of a potential issue, problem, misconduct, etc., etc. And of course, I regularly look at the Retraction Watch database, and you might ask yourselves why, because I actually we discovered that, learned about retracted papers from our institutions, from the Retraction Watch database. And of course, we are working hard to avoid this sort of short circuit where we are not informed of everything that's going on in terms of post-publication issues. So having said that, of course, there is direct communication from the journal. I must say this has never happened to me, and this has been, I've been head of research integrity, indeed founded the actual office 5 or 6 years ago, and I have never had a direct contact from a journal editor other than instances in which I had prompted a contact with a journal editor. This happened a number of times, but has always been initiated by me. And of course, this also implies that there was probably never a case where the journal editors felt they had to sort of escalate to the Research Integrity Office to resolve issues, which I guess is a good thing anyway. So just before we go on, I want to mention that when you are working in a research institution, of course, and especially as a head of research integrity office or involved in research integrity issues, everything becomes a balancing act. And personally, my work ethic is that the need to correct or to fix the scientific record trumps all other considerations. And I want to make this clear because, of course, if there's a misconduct or serious or otherwise, of course, there are other implications. There's due process and potentially there are disciplinary actions, etc. This is all very important, although mostly it is out of my hands as a research integrity office. But to me, the most important thing is to correct the scientific record. Okay, I just wanted to make this clear. And of course, the issues found by journals or internally might be due to genuine errors, questionable research practices, bona fide misconduct, and everything has to be ascertained in due time, but we'll get back to how I manage the workflow in a minute. Okay, so how do I actually deal with the issues? In terms of communication from authors, mostly my job is to provide advice on the way forward, maybe help on designing the appropriate remedial action. And this is something that happens whether the communication from authors on an issue was spontaneous or prompted by the journal, for instance. So that's one aspect of how I deal with the problems. Of course, when you have a third-party complaint or discover something serious through, for instance, a platform like PubPeer, then, as I mentioned, of course, everything gets a bit more complicated and delicate. And again, I wish to stress that you have to consider that, to me, correction of the published record is a top priority. And indeed, when this is feasible, even before due process, I try to push this forward. What I'm trying to say is that when there is evidence of a problem with a paper, serious, less serious, that anyway warrants an action by the journal, there can be a correction, a corrigendum, or even a retraction, and this can be pushed forward without interfering with due process, then I try to do this as much as possible, okay? Again, my role is to provide advice, but analysis becomes very important. And analysis means, for instance, in the case of data, it's data analysis or even image analysis. And for all these analytic needs, I usually do some easier things myself, or I interact with consultants we have internally, and specifically for image issues, image aberrations, or in general problems with presentation of the data. I am fortunate to have the help from of two image analysis experts, which I call upon when I need them. And in our case, actually specifically, the two imaging experts have trained at Embo Press specifically to deal with image issues in publications. And they trained with data integrity analyst extraordinaire, Erica Boxheimer, which maybe some of you know. So this is part of my workflow. And of course, due process means following the procedure in terms of investigation, following up, et cetera, but this is not the topic today. I just wanted to mention the fact that when there's a third-party complaint or I discover something on PubPeer, then everything is complicated by these aspects, of course. Where in the case of direct communication from the journal, again, I have not had this experience yet. I would say, fortunately, maybe, but the idea is to actively engage and collaborate with the journal. And this indeed I've done in multiple instances when I prompted communication. And of course, again, the idea is to analyze, to understand what's going on and make sure there's due process concerning the investigators involved in the process. Oh, just 1 second before I move forward. One important point is that I think it is very important to establish the actual role and responsibility of each individual author in terms of who generated the data and the figures. And this sometimes is not easy. And multi-lab collaborations tend to complicate the issues, but I'll touch upon this point later on in my presentation. So a few open questions. So something that happens more and more nowadays, and this is definitely not just at our institution, is that researchers tend to react by lowering up most of the time, which is, makes things very complicated, considering that in Italy, like in many other countries, there's no real legal framework to deal with scientific misconduct. So researchers that resort, even from the instance to consulting with lawyers and refusing to engage in, let's say, more informal discussions on the issues becomes something that essentially is making things more difficult and complicated to deal with and react to. So that's why I stress that correcting the scientific record, at the very least, is something that is achievable and at least must be done as the final goal. And the other open question is that there remains, of course, a stigma on spontaneous refractions that are ascribable to errors that the authors themselves discover, or authors themselves owning up to misconduct, maybe by 1 or 2 authors in an author roster. And this issue remains, and I have no real solution for this other than following up on many discussions in the field concerning trying to make a distinction between a bona fide retraction of a paper and a spontaneous withdrawal of a paper for whatever reason. And I think if journals manage to work a little bit more on this issue, this could improve, could sort of encourage researchers to be more proactive in correcting the scientific record. So, I would like to conclude with a few specific points that might represent a sort of let's say, a wish list for editors to consider from the perspective of a research institution. So the first point is that I would like, save of course for very trivial issues, I would like for editors to contact institutional representatives, research integrity offices if available, ideally, whenever possible. And this is not so much to ask for involvement, but to keep them informed of what is going on. Or at least encourage the authors, in any case, to involve or contact their research integrity offices. And this is especially the case, I would say, in terms of author disputes or interinstitutional issues in collaborative papers, for instance. And I think this type of issue would benefit from the involvement of a research integrity office or equivalent structure in an institution. I also think that all authors should be always included in any correspondence generated by the journal, on data integrity issues, or in general on research integrity issues in a publication. I have seen by experience that this is not always the case, and this could lead to misunderstandings and also uh, uh, let's say undesirable effects, and a certain level of injustice towards the other authors. The other point is that I would wish the editors, journals, to be a bit more reactive to spontaneous requests from institutions, from authors and institutions for corrections and retractions. As I mentioned, when these originate from the institute themselves, from the authors. Of course, these have to be explained and documented, etc. But this, I think, is a systemic weakness that probably should be corrected a little bit. So I must say that poor or low quality journals, let's put it this way, and the very top tier journals are more problematic from this point of view. But this is not just in my experience, but the experience of many other colleagues around the world. Of course, this might be for entirely different reasons, obviously. And I would say that there's a sweet spot in the middle, a number of many high quality journals, prestigious journals, historical journals that sort of sit in the middle, that are much more reactive and responsive to requests for corrections and reactions. Again, when these are fully supported by the evidence. Finally, well, second to last, I think author contribution statements should be the norm in any self-respecting journal, I think. This is very important because it helps, as I mentioned earlier, if you remember, this helps sort of identify, pinpoint who is responsible for what, and also diffuse collective responsibility when sometimes there is no collective responsibility for the misdoings of a rogue author or two in an article. And this also helps institutions deal appropriately with misconduct and help in correction or retraction when there is a multi-lab or multi-institutional type collaboration. And finally, I think it would be really interesting and innovative to ask for contact details of institutional research integrity offices or equivalent offices upon manuscript submission. I mean, you ask for so much information from authors when they're submitting a manuscript, which of course is acceptable, relatable, understandable, and agreeable. And why not also ask from the very get-go, from the start, the details of institutional research integrity offices when authors submit a manuscript? I think this would really help sort of disseminate a sense of responsibility and also caution in submission of manuscripts. Of course, everything that I said today and relates to the fact that, of course, we are dealing with responsible, professional, ethical editors in well-managed journals, which is the vast majority, of course. But just to mention the poor quality, very low tier journals, they simply don't care. This has been my experience. I have so many horror stories. They simply don't care. They're not interested. They're interested in publishing, and they simply don't care about the correctness of the scientific record, the quality of the publication, etc. So this is a problem that we all have to deal with. You have to deal with, we have to deal with. And right now, unless scientific evaluation by universities and funding agencies really changes course, I don't really see a solution for that in the immediate future. So I'll conclude here. Sorry for going a bit over time. Thank you for listening. And of course, I'm available for any question you might be interested in asking.
Thank you, Roberto. That was really interesting. We had a question while you were speaking. Hope you can hear me still. And the question was about that as a journal editor, someone had found that the author had not replied to his query about potential image manipulation. He tried many times to get hold of the author, but got no response. So what would be the best way forward?
Well, I'm hearing a lot of noise in my earphones. Is it me, or is anybody else experiencing this? Simon, are you okay with the audio?
Is anybody else having problems?
We're getting a little bit of static from Mike's, from Simone's
Donna's
mic.
just arriving as the host.
Yeah, we're getting a little bit of static from Simone's mic.
I'm going to
Okay.
turn myself off.
It's much better now. Anyway, it's much better. Okay, so to answer the question, apologies to all. To answer the question, well, I mean, clearly, the way forward is to contact a research integrity office if there is one. Sometimes there's no research integrity. Well, very often, if you look at the Italian landscape, but this is also true for many European countries. I refer to Europe because of course, I know the European landscape much better. In Italy, you would have a hard time finding a research integrity office in universities and research hospital, research institutions. There is a misconception that the internal review boards are research integrity offices. They are not. They don't even understand sometimes that they are not research integrity offices. But the point is, sometimes you will not find a research integrity office, or somehow somebody who does have that function. So in my experience as a scientific editor at Embo Press, what we would do, it was just escalate to for instance, the head of the department, director of department, director of a research divisions, or even higher up, if we couldn't sort of make contact with a significant other person. So that would be my reply. Sometimes in my experience, I remember it could be quite difficult to make contact with a third party within the institution. Not all the time. It depends, of course, but.
So would the process be to contact the institute and ask them for their research office then if the author is not replying?
I'm afraid I can't hear. Could you reply the question, please?
Sorry, just trying the audio. Would it be best to contact the research institute itself, or the author's institute, if the author is not replying and there's no integrity office?
Yes, sorry, that's exactly what I meant. So if there's no research integrity office, you go to the higher up in the hierarchical scale. You go to the director of the department, or to the dean, or to somebody else in this institution. So because contacting the institution doesn't really mean much, in the sense that you have to find a significant person to contact. And that, of course, that doesn't necessarily mean you will get a reply or even any action. But that would be yes, that is exactly my suggestion. If there's no research integrity office or ethical committee or something like that, you go to somebody higher up in the food chain. Now, of course, if one of the authors is a director of a department, if you immediately have a problem there, because higher up means going to the CEO or to the dean or the director of the institution. That's fine.
We have another query. You suggested that the author should put that detail of the research integrity office on their paper. The query was, do you think authors know who that is?
But that's a good question, and it allows me to mention that one of the possible positive effects of asking the authors to mention, to provide the contact details of the research integrity office, would be to prompt them to realize, to sort of look outside of their sort of narrow tunnel vision, which is sometimes the case, and ask themselves if there is a research integrity office, if there is somebody doing that kind of job anyway in their institution, and if there's not one, one would have to specifically ask, if you do not have a research integrity office, please provide the name of your line manager, director, dean, whatever, who will be contacted in case of an issue, of a serious issue.
Thank you. And I
so
had one
it would be educational also. That's what. Sorry.
Yes, indeed. And I had one question of my own, which is, what is the most common issue that you've come across?
As a research, you mean as research integrity office or with journals?
Queries to you from journals.
To me, usually authorship disputes, collaboration disputes, sometimes very nasty, but that's the most common thing I deal with, actually. Yeah. And then, where by authorship disputes, it also means the whole spectrum of issues that you all know very well, ghost authorship, guest authorship, and position. In the life sciences, you know very well how, well, at least in some sectors of the life sciences, position, of the authors in the author roster is a matter of life and death. So that's probably the most common issue, and collaboration issues. So who does what? Who gets to publish what?
And do you think switching on the credit taxonomy or listing who did what, that solves some of those problems? You mentioned that as being a good idea.
Yeah, I think that it doesn't really, for instance, in terms of guest authorship, it doesn't really solve anything, but it sort of upgrades the lie that you are willing to tell, right? So if you are asking for author contributions and Simone has not really participated in the paper at any level, then you even have to lie and say Simone did a specific thing. And this is not a deterrent, probably, but it does sort of escalate the type of misconduct you are committing in a way. But also it is very useful, I think, for journals, but also for institutions in dealing with the misconduct or the issue in general, even if it's not so serious. Because that way, for instance, I, as in my office, we know immediately who we have to talk with to try to solve the issue for the best. Or maybe it's another institution, so I try to talk with the other institution. So I think it could be very useful. I see that many journals are doing this, and more journals are introducing the author contribution list. I think it's very useful in general.
That's very useful to know. Thank you. So I think that's all the questions answered. That was a most interesting discussion. Thank you very much for your input and for your presentation today, Roberto. And thank you to everyone for joining us. And we'll say goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.